For those who are just joining us now, we're excited to start in a few minutes, and we've put up a poll, which we hope you will fill out just so we get a better sense of who's on the call. And feel free to chat us any questions, technical questions, or also questions throughout the presentation, and we're gonna get started in a couple minutes. All right, folks, we're gonna get started. Welcome to Solar for Co-ops and Condos. We're really excited to have you here. Hope you're all well, and it's been exciting to transition to doing some virtual workshops, so thanks for being part of these early sessions. My name is Mara Gofar, and I'm a program manager with Solar One, and I've got Noah and Annika also on the line here. Do you all want to say hello before we get started?
Hi everyone, Noah Ginsberg. I'm director of the Here Comes Solar program, and I'll just echo Marigo in just wishing everyone good health, and we're excited to be talking with you about something positive and oriented towards the future tonight.
And hi, my name is Annika Wister-Jones. I'm the Affordable Solar Program Manager. Look forward to talking with you.
Great. So thanks all for filling out the poll. We're gonna just roughly go over the results right now so that you can get a sense of who's on the call, as well as us getting a sense. All right, so the majority of folks on this call live in Manhattan. That's great, or the plurality. And next after that is folks from Brooklyn. A bunch of people know a little bit about solar and feel like they have a lot to learn, and some more just know the basics. And there's a couple solar whizzes here, which is really exciting. And I'd say that most people live in multifamily buildings that are between 40 and 200 units. So that gives us a great sense. Thanks for that. All right. So the agenda for today's virtual workshop is we're going to introduce Solar One. We're going to give you a sense of how solar technology works, talk about how you save money with solar, think about some special considerations for co-ops and condos, review a little bit more about the Here Comes Solar program, and then we're going to have a bunch of time for Q&A at the end. As you ask questions throughout the workshop, We'll answer them as they're appropriate per section, but if we don't get to it at that section, we'll get to it at the end. We usually have some time left over and we can go a lot deeper into people's specific questions at that point. All right, Solar One, who are we? We're an environmental nonprofit established in 2004 with the belief that all New Yorkers can help overcome our environmental challenges. We have a range of urban sustainability and resiliency programs and projects, including green workforce, managing a park, K through 12 green education in schools, and Here Comes Solar, which will be the focus of today. So what's the status of solar in New York City? As some of you may know, the cost of solar has declined dramatically in recent decades, both here and abroad, largely due to the decrease in equipment costs. But New Yorkers still face barriers to going solar. So particularly here, there's a lot of construction red tape, which means just a lot of bureaucracy, paperwork, permitting. There's system complexity for multifamily buildings, which is going to be the focus for today. And then just the dense urban environment can make it challenging to find viable buildings for solar. You know, buildings that have enough space on the roof or that aren't shaded out by others. So that's what really led us to develop the Here Comes Solar program. It's an initiative of Solar One, and we seek to make solar accessible to all New Yorkers. We prioritize high barrier markets such as affordable housing and folks like you in co-ops and condos. And sort of the order of operations of how we would support you is through site evaluation and solar design, building knowledge, so educating the board, financing and incentive consultation, solar installer technical assistance, and consumer advocacy during the whole process. So we're a sort of third-party entity that's there to help ensure the success of your solar project. What's the importance of solar in New York City? Solar power is key to any climate solution. Buildings account for 70% of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really exciting when there's an opportunity for buildings to actually produce their own energy. New York City's Climate Mobilization Act will put a price on carbon and require solar on all new construction projects. So that's going to be really crucial coming down the line. Solar benefits New York City's old grid. Solar power reduces New Yorkers' electricity bills, and last but not least, results in more green jobs in the city. So Noah's gonna take it away with solar technology.
Great, thanks Marigo. So before we dive into the nuts and bolts of solar panels and applications on buildings in New York City, we first want to introduce some broad concepts, which for those of you who are already solar experts, you may already know. But really just to make sure that everyone has a good foundational understanding of how solar works. So this next slide shows, it's a visualization of how solar technology works at its most basic level. Light from the sun hits a metal surface and that excites an electron which moves. And when electrons move, that is electricity. So that's an effect that was described by Einstein about 100 years ago. And then technology has been developed over the last 100 years to really effectively and efficiently capture that energy, that electricity. The technology that's used to capture sunlight and make electricity is known as photovoltaics, or PV for short. So you may see that acronym thrown around if you start looking for solar. This is a diagram of solar on a rooftop, just to give you a sense of the parts and components. So the solar panels themselves go on the rooftop. We're in the Northern Hemisphere, so to maximize the amount of energy that you get out of your solar energy system over the year, you're going to want those solar panels to be facing south, although you can put a system facing east or west and it will still perform well. There are a few other components to a solar energy system. There's an inverter that takes the power that's being generated on the rooftop and converts it into a usable form that's compatible with our electric grid. And then you have a meter that measures the flow of electricity. So another concept that I want to introduce is how to measure solar capacity and really how to talk about how big a solar energy system is. So a solar energy system's capacity is the amount of power that a system will generate in ideal conditions. So really in bright sun on a nice cool day. Solar energy systems are measured in watts, just like light bulbs. The difference being that light bulbs consume electricity while solar panels produce it. A multifamily solar array in New York City is typically between 15,000 and 50,000 watts of capacity, or 15 to 50 kilowatts. And just to give you a sense, a single solar panel is typically between 300 and 400 watts. And a typical New York City apartment needs between 2,000 and 4,000 watts of solar capacity to generate enough electricity for the entire year. So it's good to talk about the size of a system, particularly when you're thinking about installing one on your building, because that's how solar companies talk about it. And when they're selling you a system, they're going to say, you know, we designed you a 30 kilowatt system, for example. But at the end of the day, what we care about as folks that pay electric bills is kilowatt hours. So over time, solar panels will produce energy, which is measured in kilowatt hours. And that's really what we pay the utility for. Every kilowatt hour of electricity that we consume, we have to pay a certain rate to Con Ed for. Con Edison does have some of the highest rates in the United States because of our density and the complexity of our grid. So producing a kilowatt hour of solar energy can offset that expensive electricity cost and save you money. This visualization is really just to give you a sense of the seasonal nature of solar. So as you might imagine, a solar energy system is going to produce more electricity in the spring and summer than it will in the winter. And it's fairly dramatic. During the month of December, you can see this is a typical distribution for a solar energy system in New York City. During December, that system is estimated to produce 4% of what it will over the year. And in June and July, it's 12%. So you get really three times more energy per day or over the course of the month in the summer than you do during the winter when the sun is lower in the horizon. So the solar panels themselves, this is a really rugged, robust technology. It's a mature technology. The solar panels that are being installed today really use the same fundamental technology as what was used 30, 40 years ago to power satellites in outer space. The big difference, what I like to say, is that the cost has come down to earth. But that the technology is really robust. The solar panels will come with a 25-year warranty, and they're expected to last longer than that. The solar panels themselves are very low maintenance. There are no moving parts in the solar panels. There's not a whole heck of a lot that can break. They do require direct sunlight to produce. So if your building is just north of a skyscraper, you're probably not a great candidate for putting solar on that roof. And then something else that's important to mention is that solar panels and solar energy systems in New York City in general typically do not include batteries. And what that means is that they're not a source of backup power. It's a supplement to the electric grid. So the solar panels produce electricity, which is either consumed instantaneously in your building, or that electricity flows out to Con Edison's system, and you get a credit for it on your bill. An important thing to note about that is that even if you install solar panels on your building, unless you put batteries as well, when there's a blackout in the city, which is very rare, but if it happens, then your building loses power as well. There are some instances where you can put batteries with solar here in the city, but generally speaking, it's cost prohibitive. We hope that we're working on a couple of projects that include energy storage, and our hope is that over time, the cost and complexity of storage will come down. Great. So inverters. This is the piece of equipment that converts the power that's generated by the solar panels on the rooftop into alternating current, which is the form of power that we receive from Con Edison that comes through our outlets. There are two main kinds of inverters. For multifamily buildings, the most common is a string inverter. These are fairly large units, about the size of a mini fridge, and you might have a couple of them either mounted on the bulkhead of your building on on the rooftop or down in your electric room. There's another technology known as a microinverter, which is much smaller, and they're pretty neat. They're about the size of a tablet, and you can mount one behind each solar panel, and it will optimize the output of each solar panel. Those are most common for residential systems, like single-family homes, where there's some shade. So you really benefit from optimizing the output of each panel, but they are more expensive, so we don't see them quite as often. Okay, so this is an important one, and I anticipate that we'll be fielding some questions about this. So there are two different ways that solar panels are mounted on roofs in New York City, and really anywhere around the world. With proper workmanship, either one is perfectly acceptable and should not cause roof leaks and should not void a roof warranty. You have a ballasted system, which is pictured on the left. That's a solar energy system that's held in place with ballast blocks. It's an engineered system that sits on top of the roof. So there are no penetrations into the roof membrane, or at least a lot fewer than with a mechanically attached system. The ballasted system is very popular for commercial applications, and it's also quite popular for multifamily, for low-rise and mid-rise buildings. The benefits of a ballasted installation are that, at least for larger systems, it's the most cost-effective method of installation, so you can get really good pricing. But then also from the perspective of a building owner or a co-op board member, or condo association board member, you probably spent a couple of years dealing with your roof replacement. So just the thought of putting a hole in that roof is enough for you to say no to solar. And a ballasted installation does sit on top of the roof, and so it's typically very easy to get a roofing manufacturer to offer a continuance of their warranty with a ballasted installation. Just as common in the city, though, is a mechanically integrated system, which is actually fastened to the roof structure. There are a couple benefits, big benefits of a mechanically attached system. One benefit is that you can typically fit more solar panels into the same roof area with a mechanically attached system, because you don't need to put space between rows like you do with a ballasted design. And then another benefit of a mechanically attached system is that it's lighter weight. So if your building has some structural challenges, or it's just a lighter weight building, then you might opt for a mechanical attachment rather than ballasted. And then this next slide shows those two mounting methods that I just talked about, but there's a third that I want to highlight, which is a canopy array, or a pergola, which is an elevated system. So this is a mechanically attached system. It does require mechanically fastening the system to your building, but it actually elevates that system at least 9 feet in the air. And this is a quite popular system in New York City, mostly because of New York City's fire code. The fire department in New York requires access pathways on rooftops that are below 100 feet in height. And when you account for all those access pathways, it takes up a lot of the space that could otherwise be used for solar panels. The fire department will allow you to cover an entire roof with solar if you elevate that system 9 feet in the air. So the canopy array is very popular with, particularly with brownstones, but we've also worked with co-ops on solar projects that were elevated like this. Another benefit of a canopy is that it could allow for multiple uses of the space. So if you're in a building that there's some who want a roof deck and some who want solar, a canopy is a way that you can have your cake and eat it too. I should mention it's the most expensive option, but there are definitely applications where it makes sense and it's the best option for a building. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, now that we've given an overview of the solar technology, we want to talk about what makes a building a good candidate for solar. And then we're going to do a little interactive quiz where we'll look at buildings together and you all will vote whether you think they're good candidates for solar. So there are really 3 ingredients for a good candidate for solar here in the city. So the rooftop needs direct sunlight. So the most important thing is having direct exposure to the south. You need a good amount of space on that roof. So if you have a lot of vents and skylights and heating, ventilation, and cooling equipment on a roof, that's going to make it more challenging to fit solar. You could still potentially do a canopy, but again, it's just the ideal candidate is going to have a lot of open space. And then last but not least, you want to put solar on a roof that has a long life ahead of it. You can put solar on a mid-cycle roof, but one consideration is that solar panels in a solar energy system, they've got a 25-year life, which lines up pretty nicely with the life of a roof. So if you can time those two projects to happen close together, plus or minus 5 years, then that's ideal. With all of that in mind, we're going to take a look at a couple of projects together. So this first one that we're looking at, it's the building that there's a blue arrow with a red outline that is pointing at a building. And that building is kind of the one that we're talking about here. It's a 5-story walk-up in the Lower East Side. The roof is only 4 years old, and the roof area is 1,300 square feet. So I am going to send a quick poll. The question is this Lower East Side walk-up a strong candidate for solar? Yes, no, or maybe. Seeing some answers coming in. I'm going to give it another 10 seconds for answers to come in before I'll share the results and a little bit of analysis. As these questions are coming in, and actually as answers are coming in on the poll, I'm going to address a question that came in from in the chat, which is, are there setback requirements from the parapet wall for canopy arrays if the building is in a historic district? The answer to that question, Anthony, is yes. It's not a specific number of feet. It just needs to be minimally visible from public thoroughfares. On some installations that were partial canopy in historic districts, and the reason it was partial canopy was because those parts of the roof close to the parapet wall needed to be low profile, so they were not visible from the street. Okay, so I'm going to end polling here and share the results. So we got a couple yeses, a good bit of no's, and a fair number of maybes. Okay, so this was maybe a trick question because you don't know which direction is north, but if you jump to the next slide, Marigo, we do not consider this to be a good candidate for solar. The size of the roof would make it a tough project, but not an impossible one. This could be a good candidate for solar based on the size of the roof and the age of the roof, but there is a big high-rise building that's just south of that walk-up. So unfortunately, for a good portion of the year and a good portion of the day, that roof is in the shade. We're going to jump to another example as the second of our third, the second of three. Okay, so let's see. Okay, sorry about that. So this is an elevator, 8-story elevator building in Brooklyn Heights. The roof is 12 years old and it has 6,000 square feet of area to work with for solar. So I just shared a poll, and do you think this is a good candidate for solar? I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds and appreciate all of the participation. It's exciting to see everyone weighing in. All right, I'm going to end polling. Most of you said yes, some said no, and some said maybe. So this building, it is a good candidate for solar, but the caveat is that the roof is 12 years old. So we would consider that sort of a mid-cycle roof where you might need to do some roof work before you put solar on that rooftop. It is likely a really good candidate for solar. I should say it is a good candidate for solar. The question is if they should do a solar project now, or if they should do a little bit of roof work first before installing solar. Okay, and then last one. So this is in my neighborhood. This is Washington Heights. It's a 6-story pre-war elevator building. The roof is 2 years old, and there's 4,000 square feet of roof area. So I'm going to send out a poll on this one. All right. Well, and this is exciting to see. So I'm seeing almost unanimous yes coming in. So absolutely, this is a good candidate for solar. And again, not there's a little bit more nuance to it than this, but this is kind of the gist of it. Is you can really, based on the age of a roof, on an aerial image where you can see how much space is available, and it's addressed, so you can see if there's shade around it. That's really all that we need to determine if a building is a good candidate for solar. If you are curious about your building, we hope that you will take advantage of our offer to do a free assessment, which we'll send out, a follow-up with slides, and you all can reach out to us if you want that for your building. Okay, so we're gonna open it up for questions specific to the technical aspects of solar. So anything about the technology, about the mounting methods. If folks want to enter some questions into the chat, now is a great time to do that. And in a few minutes, I'm gonna pass it over to Marigo, who's going to give a presentation all about solar economics. So we'll give it a minute to see if any questions come in, and if not, we'll have more time for Q&A at the end.
So Noah, one question that we got while you were going through was whether Con Edison or anyone else in New York City buys back excess solar.
That's a great question. So the short answer, I'm sorry?
Sorry, we also got a question about net metering, so you could probably answer both of those at the same time.
That's great. Sure. And Marigo has a slide about net metering that we'll get to in a minute. The short answer is yes. A solar energy system, because it varies seasonally, we expect that, in May, June, July, if you design a system to offset 100% of your electric bill, in May, June, and July, you're probably going to be generating more solar energy than you need to offset your bill. And that does generate credits that can then be carried forward to offset your electric bill in those fall and winter months when you might not be producing as much solar energy. It used to be, up until very recently, that solar energy was valued using a system called net metering, where basically every kilowatt hour of solar energy that you generated in New York State offset essentially whatever rate you were paying to Con Edison for electricity. So kind of a 1-for-1. It's since gotten a little bit more complicated. There's a new method for calculating the value of solar energy that's known as the value stack. And we have a slide about it, which has a little bit more detail. In short, if you put solar on your rooftop, it will reduce your electric bill, and you just need to size the system appropriately so that over the course of the year, you're not generating more electricity than you need for your building. There was a question that, yep.
Another question was whether the angle of the solar cells can be adjusted.
That's a great question. So it can be, practically speaking, for solar installations on rooftops, you pick an angle and you stick with it. If you do a big solar farm on a big piece of land, in upstate New York or in the Mojave Desert, then you're going to have your solar panels on trackers, and they're going to follow the sun throughout the day, and they'll point further south in the winter and be more flat facing upright in the summer. Practically speaking, the mechanical and construction and operation and maintenance challenges associated with tracking systems has made them very rare in New York City. It's much more common to design a system that's either flat or slightly south facing, and that produces a fair amount of electricity over the course of the year.
And kind of related to the last question was if we're going to go over the VEDR rate and what a good rule of thumb for this is. So do you have a good rule of thumb for VEDR?
Gosh, there's unfortunately, I don't think there's a great rule of thumb for VEDR, which stands for the value of distributed energy resources. That's actually it's the electric rate that that's now being used in New York State to value solar energy. I think probably the clearest way that I can answer that question is that the value of solar energy does vary from building to building. And we're happy to do a free solar savings analysis for anyone who's on the line.
We have a number of questions about price, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But I think the one that's most appropriate to what we've been talking about is for the 3 installation methods, how much does each one cost for the same amount of electricity, just relatively?
That's a great question. So I would say, if we want to, I know that everybody wants a specific dollar number that's realistic. The truth is that the cost of a solar energy system does depend on the size of the system. And we are going to get into a few examples in the next section of this presentation. A ballasted solar energy system, I guess just to use rough numbers, might be $3 per watt. And then a mechanically attached system might be, for that same system, might be 10 or 20% more expensive. And then a canopy installation might be another 20 or 25% more expensive on top of that. So again, just without any more context, you could say, okay, like a ballasted installation is the most cost effective. That's often the case, but as you're going to see in the next segment of this presentation, there are a lot of incentives that are available for solar, including upfront rebate and tax incentives. And when you factor all of those in, it makes what would otherwise look like a fairly expensive system seem like a very strong investment.
Okay, and then one last question before we go on to the next section. And for anyone whose question we haven't answered yet, we'll have more time for questions at the end. The question is, what about vandalism? People from nearby buildings throwing items at panels. How durable are the panels in that regard?
That's a great question. So, vandalism of solar energy systems is incredibly rare, at least in our experience. It's just, they're not, 9 times out of 10 in New York City, because we have flat rooftops, they're not even visible from the street. So a lot of people don't know that they're there. And they are really durable. I mean, they're tested with hail. I think, if somebody really wanted to damage a solar array and went up on your roof with a baseball bat, they probably could. But it's not a common issue that we've encountered.
I'd like to add anecdotally, we just helped with the installation of a system just south of the Mets training field, or the training field for a leader team to the Mets. The building was worried about baseballs flying onto their roof. And the solar installer said that had happened to them before, and baseballs, even coming from professional baseball players, were not an issue.
It's a robust technology. And then the last question I'll address before Marigo, you should keep rolling with the presentation, is about energy storage costs. Are storage costs prohibitive only in New York City or in all 50 states? So the barrier to storage in New York City is mostly a regulatory issue. The New York City Fire Department has concerns about the safety of the battery technology that's being deployed all over the country with solar and electric vehicles. And so we're right now, basically, energy storage is it's expensive, and it's often very challenging to find a good site that can actually host an energy storage system in New York City because of the fire department's requirements. But there are some positive developments. Where there are some solar with battery backup projects that are moving through the process of getting approval from the fire department. We're hoping that those regulations will change a little bit as they see that these energy storage systems can operate safely. And at the same time, there are changes that are happening with battery chemistry that are allowing that are even safer than the lithium-ion batteries that are most commonly used. So it's mostly a New York City issue.
All right, thanks Noah and Annika. I'm gonna get us started on the next section. So this is saving money with solar. So yeah, we were just talking a little bit about solar costs and want to just get a deeper dive into that. Solar costs are typically presented in $1 per watt pricing. So if you hear that reference, that's sort of the industry standard for how you describe it. And the pricing is influenced by system size and complexity. So we talked a little bit about if it's a mechanically integrated system, it can be more costly. If it's a smaller system, it can be more costly because on a $1 per watt basis, because there are a lot of fixed costs that the installers need to cover. If it's a taller building, the price generally goes up because it's expensive to run conduit from the top of a very tall building down to the electrical room. And then creative system designs can add a premium to the pricing, so a canopy and other more complex designs. We see the price per watt go down when you have a larger system, as we mentioned, a ballasted system, and also bulk procurement. A lot of projects we work on will bid out the project collectively and in neighborhood campaigns and that kind of thing, which we can answer more questions about, but it brings down the pricing for everybody. Here is a little matrix showing pricing for solar in New York City in the past year for various system sizes, and just gives you a sense of how the price per watt goes down as the system size gets larger. And we want to give you the sense of a pre-incentive cost for a typical multifamily installation. So if you had a 30 kilowatt multifamily installation in New York City, you would multiply that by an average of $4 a watt, we would say, based on this matrix. And then you have $120,000 solar project. Again, that's all pre-incentive, so we'll get into how the majority of that cost can actually get reduced. So solar economics, you can save money through solar in two ways: utility bill savings and tax bill savings. So we're going to go into each of them. Utility bill savings. So yeah, we wanted to touch on the concept of net metering and the value stack, just so that you can conceptualize to some degree how savings will show up on your bill, but just wanted to reiterate that it's not something that you need to know at the upfront when you're thinking about a solar project. And we're happy to do a financial analysis where we would show you whether you have an option between these two or whether it's constrained by the type of building or account that you have. But just to get the concept through, so net metering is for every kilowatt hour you produce is one that you don't have to purchase from the utility. If you produce more than you need in a month, you can use the credits for the following month, so they roll over. And as the cost of electricity goes up, you realize more savings by generating your own electricity. Modified net metering is continuing for residential and small commercial. So that's just to point out that it's not available for all customers right now, but for some it will be continuing. And then the value stack. The key difference here is that a kilowatt hour that you produce generates a monetary credit in this type of crediting system, as opposed to just replacing a kilowatt hour that you would consume. So the value of that monetary credit is typically similar to the price you pay for Con Ed, but there can be some variation based on a few factors. And then the solar savings are presented on your bill as a monetary adjustment, as opposed to it just looking like you consumed less electricity. So tax bill savings and incentives. We're lucky in New York State. There's a range of different incentives available to us and in New York City. And so I'll just walk through them briefly. So if you're looking at a total system cost, the first incentive that we use in our analysis here is the New York Sun incentive. That's a rebate from the state that the installer files the paperwork for, and they're obligated to pass on 100% of the savings to the customer. And that's usually about 15 to 30% of the cost of the project. Then we have the state tax credit and the federal tax credit. Those are both income tax credits. And shortly, we're going to be talking about how those are actually claimed in a multifamily building, because it can be a little bit complex. But the value of those credits is in total 25% and 26% of the cost of the system. Just wanted to give a little acknowledgement about the federal tax credit, which is that it's going to be stepping down next year to 22%. And the reason we bring that up is just to drive home that these incentives are not all static. Some of them have known sunsets or are likely to sunset at some point. And so, we always encourage people to act quickly with solar, and this is just a view of what's available for this year. And then last but not least, the property tax abatement. If a building can claim that, that's 20% of the value of the system. And so after all these incentives, if they're all successfully claimed, you can see that majority of the cost of the project is actually offset. So what does that look like over the lifetime of a system? So there's two cash flows here. The one on the left includes a scenario in which you can claim all the tax credits. And when that happens, within the first few years after you've purchased the system, you're able to claim all of those credits and able to start saving money on electricity. And by year 4, you've paid off the cost of the system. And then the rest of the lifetime of the system, you're generating free electricity that you can claim all of. And the value of that electricity will go up over time as we anticipate the cost of electricity from the utility going up over time. Now, the excluding tax credit scenario is a good way to look at it if either you think that there are people in your building that can't claim all the tax credits, or the building can't claim the property tax abatement for a range of reasons, which we'll get into some of, or you just want to see it in like the view that the treasurer of a board would look at, where they're not going to see all the tax credits that go to shareholders and members, but they're only going to see what goes to the board itself. So in this scenario, there's a payback period that's a little bit longer, and then you're able to save electricity starting, or get out of the red starting about year 8. And so moving into actually how these types of credits get divvied up, because I've been sort of alluding to it, let's get into it for how it would work with multifamily buildings. So solar credit distribution options. There are 2 scenarios that are typically pursued for multifamily buildings in terms of what the solar is going to offset. So there's either the common area approach, where you offset the common area usage, which is lights, laundry room, elevators. Then there's also a scenario where you can use the solar power to distribute solar energy credits to residential electric bills using something that we call community shared solar. And sometimes you can do a hybrid of both. So what happens with the benefits and the costs in those scenarios? So looking at just a common area offset for a co-op building, the shareholders are the entities that are able to claim the federal income tax credit and the state income tax credit. So you may ask how that happens. The value of those tax credits are distributed by share. So depending on how much of the share you have in the co-op, you're able to claim that portion of the cost of the system and the tax credit, the percentage of that cost. And we offer some guidance for how you would go about doing that, but basically the shareholders claim it on their own tax bill. They're responsible for claiming that credit. And then the co-op is able to claim the property tax abatement because the co-op is responsible for paying the property tax bills. And in this scenario, the electricity would be reducing the bill for the co-op itself because it's offsetting the common area. I will say that if you're doing the option 2, the approach where you're offsetting residential electricity bills, then those solar savings would actually be on the shareholder side of the equation. So for a condo, it's pretty similar. The exception is that in a condo, the owners pay their portion of the property tax bill. So the property tax abatement would be accruing, the value would be accruing to the owners as savings on their bill, and the condo would be receiving the solar energy savings, and that's all. And there's a lot of considerations that come out of this complexity, and just to let you know that we will, in the next section, we'll be walking through tons of different scenarios and how a co-op or condo would make choices around this. So solar financing options. There are a range of different options that can make solar viable for most buildings, and we think of them as direct ownership or third-party ownership. So I'm just going to break it out a little bit so we can walk through both. So this is a cash purchase or a direct ownership scenario where the co-op or condo either has reserves or is able to secure a loan to pay for the system outright and benefit from all the electricity that it generates and all the tax incentives that are available. So typically, direct ownership provides the greatest long-term financial savings when you know that the building and residents can benefit from the available tax incentives. Third-party ownership. So in this scenario, a third party will install and own a solar system on your roof. And so one way that we do this is through a power purchase agreement where you would enter into a contract with a solar company who would install the system on your roof, and you would be purchasing the electricity it generates at a discount throughout the lifetime of the system. So what this means is that the co-op or condo does not actually have to pay for any system outright. It's a good option if you don't have any reserves or the ability to take out a loan, but you don't gain as much of the benefit because you don't own the system, so you're not able to claim the majority of the tax credits. And someone else also technically owns the electricity that's generated. The savings that you're able to claim are in the discounted electricity that you're purchasing from that solar company. All right, questions about how you save money through solar?
Okay, so the most recent question, second most recent question we've got is whether shareholders benefit from tax credits if they don't file or take standard deductions. I think those are two separate questions, so can you answer both?
Great, yeah, and I'm realizing that I wanted to mention a little bit about, I mentioned that sometimes you can't claim all the incentives and a little bit of the reasoning behind that some people may or may not be able to claim. So for the income tax credits, the federal and state income tax credit, they are both non-refundable tax credits, which means that when you file your taxes, you can only obtain the value of the credit up till your bill being zero. So if you don't pay any taxes at all, you can't get any value from that tax credit. It doesn't matter whether you itemize or not. I mean, it's not a deduction. It's just a credit against the tax dollars that you owe. So the reason that that's important to think about is that not everybody is eligible for those tax credits, especially if your building has a lot of folks on fixed incomes, perhaps some retired people. They can maybe claim a portion of it or can't claim any of it.
And I believe that also answers the question about SALT with a limit on deducting tax credits. It's not a deduction, it's a credit that comes at the end of your taxes. But we should also say that we are not tax professionals. And so if you have actual questions about taxes specific to your situation, you should ask your accountant.
Yeah, and just a note, when talking about the third-party ownership and in what scenarios you might want to consider third-party ownership, sort of the main one being if you want a zero-down option, but also it's preferred when some residents can't directly benefit from tax credits. So if you can't benefit from them yourself, then for the range of reasons I discussed, then buying the system outright does get more costly because you're not able to, deduct a lot of the cost from it. And that's why some people end up leaning on a third party to own it. The third party is able to benefit from the incentives, but pass on some of that value indirectly in the form of reduced electricity costs.
Is there a time limit to use the credits?
So the state and federal income tax credit can be claimed over the course of a certain amount of years. So it's 2 years for federal and 5 years for state. Is that right? Or did I have been flipped?
Yeah. The state, there's a 5-year limit, and then the federal, I don't believe there's technically a limit, but the way that the language is written is that if you don't use it all 1 year, you can roll it forward. So you can use it over at least 2 years.
Yeah. So if you don't have enough tax liability to use it all, that's sort of the purpose of being able to spread it out over the years.
What if the building isn't sub-metered or has sponsor-owned space?
What if the building isn't sub-metered? Um, so, so in that scenario, so you're describing I'm assuming a common area account with individual residential accounts. Double negative.
I-
You
well,
want to tackle this, Noah?
Yeah, I would assume that this is a master metered building without sub-metering. So the implication is that the ownership entity, the corporation, the co-op or the condo, is paying the full electric bill. So that's actually a scenario where you could get a lot of benefit from solar, because there's a big electric bill to offset, and the value of solar energy is actually quite high when it's applied to a master metered building. So in that case, you have one big bill to offset, and that makes things simple. If you have a sponsor that owns some shares, that's fairly common. The tax credits, even if you're offsetting a master metered account in a residential building, the tax credits still do pass through to shareholders pro rata. So if there's a sponsor that owns, for example, 20% of the shares, then they would be entitled to 20% of the value of the tax credit. They're not going to be eligible for the state tax credit, which is a residential tax credit. But the federal tax credit is residential, and there's a commercial version of it. So the sponsor would work with their accountant to claim the investment tax credit on their portion of the solar array.
Okay, and I have one more question, and we'll keep the rest for the end. And I don't actually know if we can answer this, but Noah, do you know off the top of your head how many community shared solar systems we've worked on in Manhattan and how many apartments were in those buildings?
Gosh, well, Annika, you've worked on a handful of them in Harlem, and I know there's several more in other boroughs. Doing community solar to offset individual apartments is certainly more popular now than it ever has been before, but it still is not the most common thing in the world, frankly, because there's a lot of complexity involved in figuring out how to structure it. That's kind of part of the analysis that we do is when we look at buildings, we see, is the building even a candidate for community solar? But I guess if you wanted a short answer, I'd say maybe a dozen.
Yeah, and I think the buildings that have done it usually are in the range of 10 to maybe 50 units. Once you get up to like 200 units, it becomes more administratively difficult. Okay, so let's keep on going and we'll keep the rest of the questions. Please keep asking questions. These are all really great questions and we'll answer them at the end.
Great. Okay, so a lot of what we've talked about up until now has been general concepts about solar, the technology, the cost, the incentives. We're now going to have something of I guess, a dialogue between Marigo and I about some specific considerations for co-ops and condos. And this is really our attempt, based on all of the co-op boards and condo association boards that we've met with over the last 5 years, and the questions we get a lot. This is our attempt to preempt those questions and to address them in an interactive way. So let's go to the first one, which is all about fairness. Presumably a lot of you are volunteer board members in your building, and you have signed up you've taken on this responsibility to really help take care of your building and keep it in good order. And there's a lot of politics involved. So there are real questions about the allocation of benefits and costs with any capital project, particularly with solar. One question that comes up a lot about the allocation of benefits is, for a building that could do community solar, should the building install solar for the common area or deliver direct utility bill savings to residents? So Marigo, I guess what are some of the conversations that you've had with shareholders and board members about this topic?
Yeah, well, I will say that some folks come in with a specific idea in mind. They want to offset the common area, or they want to offset residential bills. And what we usually do is just first try to see how big of a system can fit on the roof, because that can be a good guide for what the right strategy is. Usually if you have a smaller system, we would say, oh, this might be a good match for offsetting the consumption in the common area. And you need a larger system typically to do on-site community solar, because there is a minimum requirement of production needed to distribute to each unit for them to qualify for community solar. So there are a few restrictions in that way. But also sometimes people just have a vision of, they know that their shareholders really want to spend less money on their own individual bills. And they're excited about the idea of offsetting more of the residential accounts. And some folks want to keep it really simple, and they want it to be that the investment is made by the co-op or condo and paid out by those reserves. So therefore the utility bill savings should go directly back to offset that purchase.
Great. And then the next question, I'm just going to answer myself in the interest of time, because we want to make sure we've got time for Q&A from you all. I know folks are probably getting hungry. So how can a board ensure fairness and make sure all residents benefit from a project when not everyone gets the tax credits? One thing that we've found it to be fairly common is that a building will say, this looks great with tax incentives, this looks awesome, but let's look at the economics without any of the tax incentives and then make a decision based on that. So if a solar energy system pays for itself in 10 years with no tax incentives, and then is going to save the building money for another 15, 20 years, that's a good investment. And so the way, even though it doesn't change any economic reality of the project, some people can claim tax credits and some cannot. That's sort of an added benefit for those who are able to take advantage of it. But there's an understanding that the project is moving forward because it benefits everyone.
All right, project timing. When is the right time to proceed with the solar project? What are the risks of moving ahead now, and what are the risks of waiting?
Right. So we get this question a lot. There are a lot of folks who think that maybe the technology is going to get a lot better and a lot cheaper if they just wait a few more years. That we don't have any reason to think that that's the case. The technology is mature. The costs have stabilized over the last 4 or 5 years, really haven't changed all that much. We don't anticipate any kind of major leaps in the next 5, 10 years. So the risk of waiting is that there are a lot of incentives that are available today that we know are stepping down over time, like the federal tax credit, like the New York City property tax abatement, and like the incentive available from the state. And then this other one is also a timing question we get a lot. My building's replacing its roof next year. Should we proceed with solar at the same time, or should we just wait until the roof work is done and then deal with solar? Marigo, what would you say to that one?
If you're replacing the roof in the near term, we actually recommend that people start mobilizing their solar project now instead of waiting, because there's a lot that can be done in selecting the installer getting started with paperwork and all that. And then there's an opportunity. If you're replacing the roof, you have a chance to see the roof beams torn off. You get more photographs and design drawings, and you can even have the installer be in conversation with the roofer so that any roofing considerations related to the installation can be discussed in real time.
That's great. Okay, resident communication. So how can the board present a solar project to residents and secure support from the shareholders and the owners, particularly when the building has diverse political views? So, this is something that we've encountered on solar projects where there are people who are seemingly like ideologically opposed to solar, or they feel like, the environmental motivator that maybe many of you on this in this workshop feel, they don't feel. One of the things that we would recommend really is to focus on the financial benefits of a project. If it's a good investment and it saves people money, particularly in New York City multifamily buildings where expenses are really high, I think that's something that just about everyone can get behind. How can a board differentiate a solar project from others that are aesthetic or amenities? So this is a question that we put in here because a lot of people think, oh, solar, it's sort of an extra, it's a nice to have, in the same way of kind of like, putting up really beautiful mirrors and a backsplash in your lobby or some other amenity space. Well, solar energy systems actually pay for themselves and deliver long-term savings. So really, solar and energy efficiency are among the few building improvements that are a net positive financially for a building in that direct way. And then, Marigo, do you want to take this one? How can the board ensure that residents have the information necessary to claim tax incentives?
Sure. Well, one is we offer a guide that gives some simple instructions for for individual shareholders and members to understand how to claim it on their tax forms. And we recommend that the treasurer or someone from the board distributes information to that end to the rest of the building. And of course, as we mentioned before, consulting your own accountant is important. We're not legally able to advise you on taxes, but we definitely can provide some consultation.
Okay, and then these, I'm in the interest of time, I'm actually gonna, I think we can gloss over these a little bit, but just, when you get to the point that you've decided you're doing a solar project and it's not if, it's really how, at that point, you just wanna think about how the project is gonna be managed, with it in mind that many of you have volunteer boards and, part-time property managers, just making sure that you have answers to these questions, who from the building is gonna review the contract, what kind of restrictions do you have that you want to make sure the solar installer meets in terms of work hours and access to the site. And then really just who is going to be the designated contact that will be communicating with your solar company through the project completion, and just to kind of make sure that everything is closed out. This is sort of in the same vein. Once a system is fully installed, these are important things to think about. So again, solar is low maintenance, but it's not no maintenance. And it's important to know what to do in that unlikely event that you do have an issue with the system. So most solar companies in New York offer either a 5-year workmanship warranty or a 10-year workmanship warranty. And that's on top of all of the equipment warranties. But it's really important to understand, what is your solar company required to do per their contract regarding the system performance? Who's going to have access to the solar monitoring system? So every system, every solar energy system today has a monitoring system installed that should be accessible online. Is your solar company going to be actively monitoring it? Is someone from your board going to agree that they're going to log in once a quarter to look, or once a year to see how much it produced versus what was in your estimate? And then this last question here is just something to think about, making sure that you know what to do if there is an issue with the system's performance. How can you contact your solar contractor to get it addressed? Okay, so I guess to wrap things up, I'm just going to give a quick overview again of the Here Comes Solar model, the way that we support solar projects. So let's jump right to the next slide, which again, our model was designed to help people have successful solar projects. The first thing that we do, if you follow up after this workshop and say you want a free assessment for your building, we'll ask you to send us a recent electric bill so we can confirm what rate you have with the utility and make an accurate solar savings estimate. Next, we will do a free remote solar design and put together a cost savings estimate that gives a breakdown of costs, incentives, and utility bill savings over 25 years. We will then talk on the phone with you and others from your building to review that estimate and answer your questions and hopefully help you move the project forward. And at that point, if you decide that you want to do a solar project and you want to have our support with project implementation, then we would do an on-site assessment, we would do a shade study, take photos of the electric room, photos of the roof, and gather all of the information that you would need to get a firm quote from a solar company. We would again consult with the building to make sure that you have absolute clarity on what your preferences are related to solar design and what your values are, what you really want in terms of a solar installation contractor. And then we would put together a request for proposals and get you bids from local solar companies. So through our program, we work with most of the solar companies that operate in New York City at any meaningful scale. We run requests for proposals on a regular basis. Typically a couple times a month, we'll have a solar project that we put out to bid to companies that we've pre-qualified. We'll get you probably 3 or 4 bids is most typical. And then we put together a bid comparison form so that you can easily compare those bids based on pricing, equipment, installer qualifications, and all of that. and we'll help you with the process of interviewing your solar installation finalists. And then you pick your solar company and you're off to the races. So that's really our model in a nutshell. Before we open it up to just general Q&A, just want to highlight a couple of photos of co-op buildings that we've helped install solar. And Annika, I'm glad that you're on because Annika worked with most of these buildings. So this is a co-op in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. You can see there's a canopy in the middle of the roof. This is in a historic district, which is why there's no canopy at across the whole building, but just in the middle where it's not visible from the street. This next photo is of a co-op building in Harlem. So that's the northern edge of Central Park. That is a ballasted installation laid flat, flush with the roof. And then this last one here is a co-op in the Lower East Side, a smaller co-op, a walk-up building that put a mechanically attached solar array to offset their common area expenses. So with that, I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. I know that we're almost at time, but Marigo and I are happy to stay on the line and answer questions for another 15 minutes and encourage all of you to follow up with us about your building. We're happy to have a more in-depth conversation tailored specifically to you at another time.
Great. So I think that maybe my favorite of the questions that have come in recently is, does a tenant need to convince the building to install solar on the roof in order to participate?
So for a co-op or a condo, I'm assuming that the majority of tenants are shareholders. So our recommendation would be to talk to the board and encourage them to get a free solar assessment. If that board is not responsive, you could ask them when the next board election is and run.
What if the board decides they don't want to put solar on the roof? Are there any other options?
So we talked about community shared solar a little bit. That's something that you can do both within your building and outside of your building. So if you've tried everything and you can't convince your board to go solar, we can help connect you to a community solar project, which is a way that you can subscribe to a solar system that is somewhere else in New York City, but benefit from the credits that it generates and save some money on your utility bill. And that's something that's great for renters or for any building that's not a good candidate for solar or a building that just isn't able to go solar. You can save money on your personal utility bill.
Do companies offer roof and solar installation together?
That's a good question. There are a couple of local solar companies that do both. The majority of solar companies that we work with are really solar specialists, and they have a lot of experience working with roofing companies. I think that if your building is at a place where you need to replace your roof and do a solar project, it's worth considering working with one company for both, but I wouldn't assume that it will necessarily be one project.
What about buildings where residents are individually billed for electricity? The co-op is billed only for electricity use in the common spaces. Can we just go over how community solar works in co-ops one more time briefly?
Yeah. So yeah, you can either offset the common area, but if you want to offset individual units, there's the way that you can distribute the credits that are generated from the system on the roof to those individual units to their utility bills. So it's not a physical connection. It's not like you're tying in like the meter for every apartment unit. It's really a programmatic thing where you would tell Con Edison, okay, we produced 10,000 kilowatt hours on this roof this year, and we want to divide it amongst 10 apartments buildings, and then you would see a monetary deduction on your Con Ed bill.
As you know, Governor Cuomo has prohibited non-essential construction because of COVID-19. It's unclear when that will be lifted. Does non-essential construction include solar installations?
That's a good question. So it does include solar installation. Solar companies, for the most part, are not doing construction right now. There are a few exceptions. There are projects that have been deemed essential by the governor's office, and affordable housing has been deemed essential by the state. So there are some solar projects that are ongoing, but for the most part, the solar installation companies, much like a lot of other companies right now, are eagerly waiting for the situation to be different so they can resume construction. And I will say that all the companies that we're working with are thinking about it very responsibly and wanting to make sure that they're providing appropriate protective equipment for their staff. And they obviously want to maintain their livelihood and maintain their business, but not at the risk of public health.
And I also want to say that construction is essentially the last step in a very long process for going solar. There's a lot of engineering and design and permitting that needs to happen before you get to construction. And before that, you need to select a solar installer. So it's conceivable that you wouldn't even notice the construction stop because it will take a number of months before solar could go from start to finish of the pre-construction process.
Thanks, Annika. Yeah, and also just to mention that our program model, we have site assessors on staff that normally do on-site assessments where they come out to your building and do a shade study and take photos. We've adapted our process in light of COVID-19 where we work with existing building staff. So if you have a super on-site or a porter who still is working in your building, we would text them a guide for what photos we need for our site assessment and for to put out a request for proposals for solar, and then text them a link that they can use to upload those photos and be on the phone with them walking through, making sure we're getting everything that we need. And we've had success doing that. So we're able to offer our services end to end right now. We, again, like everyone else, we're hoping that the situation changes and we can get back to some semblance of normal, but we are fully operational.
A couple clarifying questions on things that we've talked about previously. This was back when we were talking about battery storage in the city. Is the majority of battery storage projects in New York City and probably nationally, is it lithium ion or another type of storage?
Yeah, it's primarily lithium ion. That's the type of battery where the costs have come way down and it's really energy dense. So you can store a lot of energy in a small physical space, which is really important for electric vehicles and also for applications like providing backup power to buildings.
And then this should be a quick answer. Do condos have to create a corporation to own the system?
They do not. So most typically it would be the condo association that would enter into the contract with the solar company for the system. The condo association would pay for the solar energy system, and then all of the individual owners would claim their share of the tax incentives.
How many units is the max, or how many floors is the max?
It's a tough question. I don't think there's a unit max. Really, if a site is good for solar, we're happy to support on that. In terms of the height of a building, as buildings get taller, it does get more expensive to do solar. We don't typically, it's atypical for us to work with buildings that are more than 20 stories, but it's not unheard of.
Does Solar One assist only multifamily buildings, or do we assist commercial buildings as well?
We assist all types of buildings. So we've done work with 1 to 4 family brownstones, co-ops and condos. We do commercial properties. We have a few different projects going on with real estate companies who have large portfolios. So really anything and everything. If there's any building of interest, you can reach out to us.
Are tax credit distributed equally across the number of units?
Your turn, Noah.
Sorry, folks, I have a little bit of background noise. But the tax credits are distributed pro rata based on ownership shares. For some co-op buildings or some condo associations, that's going to be an equal distribution for every owner. And in other cases, maybe a larger apartment might have more shares than a smaller apartment.
What zone or zones is the proposed solar array on Rikers Island going to be associated with?
That's an interesting question. So Rikers Island, there have been a number of initiatives to sort of reimagine Rikers as a sort of a Green New Deal model with large scale solar. I don't actually know which load zone it would be in. For those that aren't fluent in utility speak, Con Edison is broken up into, well, actually, I take that back. Isn't all of Con Edison, New York City, load zone J?
Yeah, yes, unless they're asking about some other like CSRP zone.
Okay. Well,
but it should be in the New York City zone.
Yeah. So, we would love to imagine a world in which Rikers Island is used to produce clean energy for our city. And hopefully hopefully there are fights over whether that power is sent to the Bronx or Queens. But either way, it'd be a good outcome.
Yeah. What's the price per watt in 2020 for New York City?
So we have a slide, maybe we can jump back to it, but we have a slide showing per watt by system size. It's something like, I want to say about $4 a watt. And it really does vary based on the size of the system. So for a really big system, if you're talking about a commercial installation on a warehouse, it's almost half the price per watt as a small system on a single family home. So the average price, this is for projects that applied for incentives with the state since January 1 of 2019 up through March of this year. So it's about $3.50 a watt.
Great. Do you know off the top of your head who the largest solar panel manufacturer and the largest battery manufacturer whose systems are being installed in New York City?
That's a good question. I don't know. Batteries, there are very few batteries that have successfully been installed in the city, possibly with the exception of small installations in Staten Island and Eastern Queens that look like the suburbs rather than kind of the dense multifamily part of the city. With solar panels, I can tell you the ones that we encounter a lot. So we see a lot of LG solar panels. We see a lot of SunPower. We see a lot of Canadian solar. Gosh, Marigo, Annika, what are some other ones that we see a fair amount of?
Hanwha is a pretty common one these days.
Yeah. So, most of these solar panels, I mean, they all come with 25-year warranties. They have very similar efficiency. So we tend to emphasize with when we work with buildings on solar projects, we actually think the bigger decision that you're making is the solar company that you go with rather than the solar panel manufacturer. Because again, the solar panels are really reliable. They're really robust. Failures are incredibly rare. But, if something does happen with your solar array, you want to make sure that you've got a good relationship with a trusted local solar company that could come and address that for you.
Okay, and then the last question I have here is, does solar serve mostly residential or commercial, parentheses, duck curve? I think this might be a good chance to talk a little bit about how New York City is addressing the duck curve.
Sure. Annika, I feel like you have something specific in mind. I mean, what I can say is that solar growth has been happening in the United States. There's been a huge uptick in residential solar installations in the suburbs. There's also been a huge amount of growth of utility scale solar projects and large community solar projects upstate. New York City is unique. We've got small buildings, we've got flat roofs. We don't fit kind of the national model of solar in field, solar on big box stores, and solar on single family pitched roof homes. So that's why, you know, that frankly, that's the reason that Solar One as a nonprofit is focused on this. We want to see solar growth happening in the city at the same pace or even faster than it is everywhere else in the country where they don't face the same barriers.
Yeah, and just in some parts of the country, often you hear about Hawaii or California where residential solar is really widespread. What's called the duck curve can happen, where in residential areas, solar produces the most power in the middle of the day, and then the amount of solar goes down, but the amount of usage when people come home and turn on their lights goes up, and so there's a mismatch there. In New York City, first of all, that's just not at all an issue because there's vastly more energy usage in the city than we could put a dent in with our current solar production. And also one of the aspects of the value stack that Marigo and Noah talked about earlier is a value that's based on the location of the solar. So the reason why we can't give you a specific rule of thumb number for the value of solar is because if you're in Harlem, for example, like a residential area, the value is a little bit lower than if you're in Sunset Park, where it's primarily commercial and industrial, and energy is used mostly during the day when the sun is shining. So solar serves both, and it serves commercial most efficiently, but every type of customer can use solar effectively.
Thanks, Annika. I saw a question just come in about the solar mandate that New York City recently enacted. So for those who haven't heard of this, last year around Earth Day in April, New York City passed the Climate Mobilization Act, which was a suite of bills, local laws that put a price on carbon emissions here in the city associated with large buildings, but also mandated solar or a green roof for all new construction projects and for substantial renovations that change the physical dimensions of a building. You know, it's a great question. We didn't talk about it too much in this workshop because we assume most of you are in existing buildings, but absolutely a new building that goes into the Department of Buildings today, there's going to be a requirement that they either put solar on the rooftop or a green roof. Okay.
All right.
Well, gosh, it's been really a lot of fun spending the evening with you all and talking about solar. We really do encourage you, if you're thinking about solar for your building, please do reach out to us. Our email addresses are on the screen, or if you complete the intake form on our website, we'll be sure to follow up with you guys quickly about solar for your building. Just more than anything else, just want to wish everyone continued good health. And we appreciate your time and really glad that you tuned in tonight.
Thanks, everyone. Great to have you here. We'll send out a follow-up with the slide deck and everything you need to know.
Take care.
Happy dinner.